Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Jerome Hunt. I'm an assistant professor at Long Beach City College, and I am the chair/discussant for our panel, Theorizing, Oppression, and Resistance. We have two wonderful presentations here for us today. We're gonna get started with Dr. Terri Jett from Butler University, who's gonna go first, and her paper is entitled Talking About Race, James Baldwin and Margaret Mead, Then and Now, and we're going to follow that up with a PhD student, Isabel Gonzales from the University of California, Irvine, whose paper is about Break the Binary, Blake Brockton, Transmedicalism, and the Agnostic Difference of Racial Capitalism. So each presenter is going to have about 20 or so minutes to give their presentation, and we'll follow it up with a Q&A. And I should let you know that Dr. Jett is going to have to be leaving us immediately following her presentation, but she's going to give you her contact information in the chat there. Okay, and I also see that we have our other presenter coming in, so I'm going to admit her in now and then introduce her, and then I'll turn over to you, Dr. Jett.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi, Christina. Thank you for joining us. I was just introducing. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought. Sorry. My apologies. I thought that it was our presenter. Are you our presenter that just joined us? Okay, because the names are very similar, so I'm sorry. I thought that you were our other presenter. Zoom, you never know what you're gonna get. Sorry. Okay.
Totally understandable. I'm gonna be camera off because I'm having lunch, but
okay, no worries. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. All right, sorry about that. I'll turn over to Dr. Jett now. Thank you.
Hi, so thank you everyone for joining. I'm Terri Jett. I am gonna have to jump off like right after I finish, which will be like at 4 o'clock because I have a meeting, unfortunately, to attend involving the president of a university. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everyone can see my PowerPoint. Let's see. Can everyone see that? Okay, so I am, this is a book project that I'm working on, and I'm revisiting a conversation that was had by James Baldwin and Margaret Mead basically 50 years ago, in August 1970, or a little over 50 years ago, and they tape recorded their conversation. And it's called A Rap on Race. And so I discovered this book because I was in a used bookstore, which I always go into when I'm traveling, and just stumbled on this book. I didn't even know this conversation existed, and that was actually a few years ago. And so I thought about it, the context of their conversation being held in 1970. And thinking about conversations around race and challenges that we have today. So I thought, I will take their conversation, looking at it in the context of the Nixon administration, and then move it into the context of the Trump administration, because there's some similarities there. And so I thought about, why revisit this conversation? It's because I was thinking about, what were the similarities between the time period, the political atmosphere and the historical context, and what were we coming out of, and the transformation that was happening during in society, in the US in particular. And so, when they had that conversation, and by the way, they were seasoned public intellectuals at that time. And James Baldwin was kind of visiting from Turkey. He returned to Turkey right after that conversation. But he and Margaret Mead they just met through a friend. They really didn't know each other that well. And so the conversation was a little bit disjointed. But I thought about, okay, Nixon, what was going on, 1970, why was he even elected? And there was somewhat of a backlash that was taking place. And we were coming out of several periods of grassroots movements, with civil rights and voting rights, women feminist movement, second wave, basically anti-war, LGBT, not quite Q at that point, Black and Brown Power, Black Panther Party, Brown Party. American Indian movement. So many, so much grassroots movements and efforts that were taking place from a number of groups that were really trying to expand their ability to fight for their rights and participate politically, and with some success. There was also a large growth of Black urban populations that was kind of towards the end of the Great Migration. And then white flight movement into suburbia. So many things happening. And there was a distinguishable shift to the right occurring kind of at the state level. Nixon also, and when I think about Nixon and Trump, kind of comparing them, of course, they're completely different and they had some different experiences, but he was considered a political outsider, even though he had been very active in politics, just his, sort of personality. And of course, he faced impeachment, but he resigned before that happened. And then we have Trump. And I will say that I've been working on this book for over a year, a couple of years, actually, because I was working on a different book at the same time, which I finished that book. But so many shifts happened because when I first thought about, the connections between not just the Nixon presidency and the Trump presidency, I was thinking about, would it be possible to use the Baldwin-Mead conversation as a model for us to have conversations about race across political divides, even recognizing that there are some people you just can't have a conversation with, quite frankly, but thinking like if there was some movement, maybe just some misunderstandings or some lack of historical knowledge, would conversations be the vehicle to bring more people into drawing connections with one another? And thinking about the Baldwin-Mead conversation, even though they were both kind of on the left of center, they did have some differences with regard to their experiences and their identity, and just how they saw the politics and the issue of race also at the same time. So, Donald Trump led the birther movement. He's came out of the rise of the Tea Party that was kind of happening sort of at the same time following his presidency, followed the Obama presidency. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that was like a big left shift, because Obama was very much sort of a moderate, but still there was a shift in the kind of political atmosphere and culture with his two terms. Donald Trump also marked by impeachment, actually was impeached twice, and also considered an outsider, even though he was a celebrity, but he's a political outsider. And then he has created this cult of personality, which was something that I wouldn't necessarily say Nixon had, but Trump has done that. What has, let me actually continue. So I'm going to just briefly, for a moment, play. Hopefully this will work. I was going to let you just listen to Baldwin-Mead talk for a moment.
I learned about race when I was a child.
How did you learn about that?
Well, I lived on a farm that had been a station on the Underground Railroad.
In the north, then?
In the north, in Bucks County.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I have completely northern ancestry, and my grandfather fought in the Civil War, and on the northern side. We bought a farm with a station on the Underground Railroad. This was good and romantic, good northern behavior. And we had two old men in the neighborhood who'd been slaves, but who'd dropped off and hidden and stayed there. One of them had a young wife. He must have been 70, I suppose, when I was a child. It was a long time before. But he had a young wife, very fat young wife. And she had a half-white son. And what I was told by my mother, who believed in telling children the truth and telling it correctly so they wouldn't get it wrong, that she'd been raped by a white man. I had the reverse picture that most Americans have, you see, because most white women picture of rape is a black man. I mean, this is one of the important things one has to remember all the time.
This is very funny.
But I got it reversed. And my picture of rape was a black woman raped by a white man. He was a butcher, too. And that's one of those accidental things, and he was a brutal character. So that whenever I dreamt of rape, I mean, I always knew Mother insisted on our calling her Mrs. Stewart. Remember, this is 1912.
Yeah, wow.
And whenever she cropped up in a dream, I knew what I was dreaming about.
Yeah.
You see, but now this is a straight reversal of.
So in the interest of time, I won't have you listen anymore, but that's available on YouTube. So you can listen to it. You're not going to listen to the entire conversation, but you'll hear a significant portion of it. And actually, there's been a lot of critiques of the conversation because they were sort of talking past one another. But still, they were making some interesting points about how they think about the issue of race, and also about the context of what was going on at the time. And neither one of them were Nixon supporters. Some of the key themes that comes up, because that's what I've sort of read about and looked for in reading the text, was, well, what sort of themes were they bringing up that sort of resonate today when you're having a conversation or thinking about, well, conversations about race and society and institutional racism and structures and all of that. What are the things that you use to drive your conversation? Or your connections. And one is about, they talked about their own identities, formation, why they think the way they do. We call it, political socialization, that sort of thing. They talked about power and social mobility. So who has, is in power making decisions, who has the right to move from one class to the other, and who's constrained, of course. Baldwin very much talking about the Black experience at the time. Issues of immigration came up, and migration movement. Issues of state violence, of course, and repression of free speech and of activism was part of their conversation. They talked generally about American democracy and capitalism and participation, also about marginalization and oppression. And of course, they talked about the media and the perception of issues of race and identity. And so when I think about what they covered, it's that, well, some of these things would also come up today. If we were just kind of two or, three people in a group having a conversation. And I have thought about this in terms of, could this be a model? And first I thought, as I was first starting to write this book, like, yeah, this could be a possible model for kind of engagement and conversation and coming together. However, during the process of my writing this book, things became more and more extreme with regard to, well, just the pandemic, but also the Trump administration, the rise of visibility of white supremacy. It was always there, but it has just become more visible and more active, and just, it really has changed the way that I think about the possibilities that exist. So I actually have changed the way I've been writing this book. And so when I think about, can we, and I'm kind of finishing with this, can we have these types of conversations today? And would they make a difference? And I'm still wrestling with that. I'm trying to be hopeful, but at the moment I don't, especially after what happened on January 6th and leading up to that, and all of the voter repression and the violence that has taken place. It has really just kind of changed my thoughts about it. Also, I think, well, they weren't necessarily, when I think about Baldwin and Mead, they weren't quite political rivals, even though they had their differences, but they actually had a lot of similarities. They both were able to see the country from the outside. Baldwin as an expat, and Mead as someone who was kind of this global traveling anthropologist, even though there were a lot of challenges with the work that she does. Also, there is a difference today in the manner in which we communicate just from 50 years ago, with regard to social media, our virtual engagement like we're doing right now, texting, email, all of that didn't even exist or was barely being started. So, how has that changed the way that we can engage face-to-face or have interpersonal contact, relation, and understanding? There is a differences. And then, like I said, my own thinking has shifted with regard to the attempted insurrection and the ability of people to actually think and behave rationally, I guess, is why I question that quite a bit. And so that is basically kind of the end of my presentation. And Unfortunately, I will have to leave, but I look forward to anyone contacting me and letting me know your thoughts about and any ideas you have so that I can work towards completing this book.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jett, for your presentation, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you. Okay. Right. So next we are going to go to Isabel Gonzales.
Okay, so I also have a PowerPoint. Let me pull that up. I am not seeing it on. I don't know if I'm able to share my screen. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I'm just going to be reading from my PowerPoint in terms of this project. This is building on a project that I'm using for my dissertation. One of the chapters of my dissertation is going to be really focused on two subjects, of which Blake Brockington is only one portion of this this project. So I will begin. Oops, sorry. I don't know. I'm having some technical issues. Sorry. I don't know why it's not letting me share.
You may have to stop sharing possibly and then try to redo it. That usually works sometimes.
Yeah. This is the first time it has stopped me from sharing. So
Okay.
I don't know what's going on. Okay, great. So again, I'm just going to be reading from my paper, just going to be really thinking about these ideas as they're developing. So in Black on Both Sides, C. Riley Snorton begins by turning to Blake Brockington, a teenager who made headlines as the first trans homecoming king in North Carolina. Brockington's sensibilities, Snorton writes, quotes, underscores how Blackness and transness are tethered in the contemporary landscape in terms of visibility, in which the form of attention directed at Black and trans people is frequently articulated through politics. Building on Snorton's argument, I argue that contemporary articulations of queer and trans assimilation reveal the very ontologies of racial capitalism itself. Brockington's understanding of a Black trans masculinity outside of binary oppositions, I argue, reflects Snorton's understanding of Brockington's sensibilities, but also offer a glimpse towards a sensibility that rejects the difference-making power of racial capitalism's ordering project. So, as argued by Cedric Robinson, the economic systems of Europe that would develop into capitalism were always racial, a result of the particularistic ordering of European society through antagonistic differences. As the particularistic origins of the Western order, the production of antagonistic differences through difference-making processes would later crystallize into racial differences. The social tendency of European society to produce and organize around antagonistic differences is racial capitalism's epistemological foundation. And given its particular nature to European sociality, Robinson emphasizes that difference-making is a process, one that must be produced and enforced through constructs and myths, or what he calls forgeries. However, though the dialectic production of acceptable and unacceptable sexuality and eroticized subjects through myth-making is, in Robinson's own analysis, necessary for the project of racial capitalism, Robinson does not account for the importance of sexualities as important sites through which forgeries are made themselves. So what I propose is a frame of sexual myth-making, that sex and eroticism are not merely part of racial myth-making, but instead are part of a process of sexual myth-making, a process by which difference is created and reified, producing abject sexual subjects that can be exploited or surveilled by the state, whose labor is exploited by capital and against whom violence can be committed. What makes sexual myth-making important is its key role as a technology to control reproduction, both the literal biological processes of pregnancy and birth and reproduction of capital and culture. And much like the particularistic tendency of European society to produce racial difference, racial capitalism's pre-capitalist history reflects how the production of antagonistic differences has been utilized to control reproduction, with whiteness as a privileged site. And it does this in part through producing the gender binary. So I don't have slides for this because I kind of move some stuff around. But in writing about the construction of the witch, Silvia Federici points to how the figure of the witch helped to produce the meaning of womanhood. That is to say that the witch was a modality of difference or a myth against which the gendered position of woman as a bourgeois European gender under a newly developing economic regime could be contrasted. The witch's myth was defined through her relationship to sexual transgression. And in reality, what defined those persecuted as witches were those challenges that they posed to the entrenchment of the capitalist order, or the development of this capitalist order, through their relationship or their relationship or power over reproduction and non-reproduction. So we see that midwives and sex workers are often those who are mythologized as witch. Though the witch's non-reproductiveness extended beyond her role in biological reproduction, the figure of the witch was at her core fundamentally tied to a sexuality that was in contradistinction to and in excess of the proper quote unquote sexuality of a bourgeois woman, and the function as a whole of woman as a bourgeois subject in this growing capitalist order. So in this sense, the application of sexual myth-making as a technology of racial capitalism not only produced subjectivities against whom the weight of the state could be applied, but I would argue it produced this queer gendered position. So even though Federici argues that, quote, the language of the witch hunt produced the woman as a different species, I would instead argue that the processes of sexual myth-making produced the witch not necessarily as woman per se, but instead the witch functioned as this third gender position. So as a third gender position, the witch became the marker that the gender of woman, which was again this bourgeois construct of this newly developing economic order, that woman could be contrasted against. Woman was fundamentally bourgeois, or was working in the service of reproducing bourgeois interests. She did not occupy this developing public sphere. She only occupied this developing private sphere. And her sexual life existed only in service of reproducing the social and economic order that capitalism was producing. Despite her status as being understood as natural, in contrast to the witch's status as being understood as unnatural, woman as gender was unstable. So somebody who was gendered as a woman could transition into being gendered as witch through participating in excess or non-reproductive forms of being. So while the witch as trans white feminine subject represents sexual myth-making's necessary function, it's the application of this third genderedness to whole classes of racialized subjects that returns us to this interlinkage of racial myth-making and sexual myth-making. In producing Africans and indigenous peoples of Turtle Island as always already witches, so these associations with witchiness applied to entire races of people, or what we're creating as entire races of people, the association helped to reify and reproduce another long-standing myth, that of Africans and indigenous peoples of Turtle Island as always already excess, sexually excess, and in the ordering of capital, just being produced as excess population or surplus population. This fusion of racial and sexual myth-making helped to justify the tremendous modes of violence, including, but not limited to, the complete gender side of third gender people like the Hoyas in Spanish colonized California, necessary to produce this quote unquote new world, to create the idea or the myth of terra nullius that was produced through enclosure, extraction, and exploitation, ripe for the expansion of capitalism's economic ordering of the world. This cosmological and mythological sort of ordering and this association of Africans and indigenous peoples of the Americas with the myth of the witch was built and reified and supplemented by the burgeoning medico-scientific discourses working to naturalize the European system of gender developed out of the witch burnings. So this European system of gender built upon antagonistic differences in the form of a gender binary. So thinking about how a gender binary is ontologically coming out of the same roots as race making, as Robinson describes it. And this gender binary's purpose serving as a means through which to ensure the reproduction of capital. This gender binary smuggled myths of natural and unnatural sexual excess of colonized populations under the guise of scientific rationalism. So even beyond these witch burnings, European medico-scientific understandings of the world and European cosmological understandings of the world were not fundamentally incompatible. Instead, again, they're coming out of the same ontological origins. Contemporaneously, medicine and science have a large role in both disciplining queer and trans subjects and in allowing these subjects to become subsumed into projects of reproducing whiteness. I'm going to be talking here about this process of transmedicalism, a tendency through which we see mostly white trans people reproducing whiteness through this appeal to the legitimacy of medico-scientific discourses. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about that as an assimilatory project as well. So transmedicalism situates the legitimacy of transgender life within the narrow confines of what has been legitimized by medical and state authorities, viewing those who do not experience dysphoria or people outside of the gender binary as not legitimate transgender subjects. This alignment with ideologies of gender that are sanctioned by the state through medical knowledge, quote unquote, makes visible the role of some transgender people in maintaining white hegemony and ascending to a position of conditional sexual acceptability. If, as the transmedicalist argument goes, the only real genders are those legible within medical discourses, as Buck Angel implied in a series of May 2019 tweets, then at its core, transmedicalism seeks recognition under regimes where being made a natural woman or a normal man, quote unquote, are, to quote C. Riley Snorton, quote, expressed and arranged according to the logics that sustained racial slavery. In this way, by dedicating themselves to maintaining a regime of difference-making that is a construct of Euro-Western ordering and state-making, those dedicated to the transmedicalist paradigm are quite literally ensuring the reproduction of a colonial white hegemony, allowing for the maintenance and reproduction of white hegemony through the policing of gender categories. And with this in mind, I turn to Blake Brockington and how he theorized gender outside of this and theorized gender in resistance to this. So Blake Brockington was he was well known for being this almost exceptional figure. So he might in some ways embody a sort of trans exceptionalism, but the ways that he articulated gender was instead a refusal of these antagonistic differences of Euro-Western gender binaries. And he forces us and orients us towards this imagining of gender outside of and beyond the romances of the negative imposed by racial capitalism's ontological hegemony. So we see this first in his blog, right? So he was on Tumblr from 2011 to 2015 during the time of his death, or 2015, which was when he passed. His blog title, Brown Boy Magic, offers a first glimpse of understanding the gender binary or gender beyond the Western gender binary. His blog title, Brown Boy Magic, is a play on the phrase Black girl magic, and as a chosen name, it aligns himself with Black womanhood in a way that is unthinkable to those operating from the transmedicalist paradigm. According to transmedicalist logics, he should want to distance himself from any articulation of girlhood, but he chooses to self-define in coalition and kinship with Black girl magic, eschewing the rejection of girlhood necessary to be recognized as a legitimately trans subject in the eyes of the state and medico-scientific elite networks. Similarly, his use of boy with 3 I's instead of boy with a Y also positions him outside of the Euro-Western gender binary. This is a term that has long been racialized and understood as a racialized queer term, and it is flexible and fluid. So this isn't, again, to deny his trans masculinity, but instead is to say that Brockington's understanding of his own trans masculinity embraced the transformability and inability to be held embodied in the making, or embodied by the meaning of boy, right? In this self-making, he challenges the imposition of antagonistic differences and transmedicalism's trans-assimilationist appeal to these forms of state power through medico-scientific indexing. He's refusing the straightforward binary narrative of gender dysphoria and aligns himself with the gendered subjectivity that under these, again, medical scientific logics of medical-centric transition should bring him nothing but pain and misery. So he's unsettling this gender binary and even this trans defenses of this gender binary. He's refusing in this way to be held by the gender binary that was imposed again by these Western structures of ordering, or these Euro-Western structures of ordering. In this post, which I shared at an earlier conference, we see that he's also further building up this challenge to this Euro-Western system of gender binarization. He's posing here in this pink tulle petticoat with this wand that has a pink, or no, not a pink, like a light Venus symbol on top. It's a little bit small, but the accompanying text to this photo set reads, quote, "When I was little, the only dresses and skirts that I liked were the spinaroonie ones because they are so much fun to play in. After trying to come into myself, I decided to try killing every piece of me that was feminine because I was introduced to this masculinity requirement to pass as male and to be trans enough in general. For the past year and a half, I've been telling a lot of my friends to break the binary, and I shouldn't stop myself from feeling cute as fuck just because other people might not feel comfortable with it. It will probably take some time before I can wear this out and about, but I am proud of myself for being able to put this on and take these pictures and make this post and not care too much about it." He ends with this phrase, "I'm still a king." So what's notable here is how he articulates the ways in which the gender binary is pressed onto trans subjects, not just from cisgender society, but from trans society as well. His understanding of passing and the masculinity requirement is this violent force imposed upon him by other trans people. This idea of not being trans enough is this fundamental operating logic of transmedicalism. Without this supposed necessity to appeal to medico-scientific discourses and to state power, there would be no need to ask if one is trans enough. One would just simply transition. So for him to take on this sort of performance, for him to embrace an expression of gender that many would call feminine, including posing with a wand topped with a Venus symbol, this symbol that has in many ways come to symbolize bioessentialist notions of gender, all while decrying to break the binary, he's calling for all of his friends, so including his followers and those touched by his life, to do that very thing, right? He's choosing to embrace gender disruption. This is also seen in his response to another post that another user shared. So he says to this post, "Black boys in pink unite." It's a rallying cry akin to break the binary, but with less of a focus on working against trans assimilatory logics and more on building community, coalition, and companionship among Black, queer, and trans people. It's a project of self-naming, calling out not just to boys with the Y, but boys with the I and the Z. So further advancing that politics of connectivity, we see that Brockington leaves comments in the tags of this post that are, I don't think that they're visible here, but they're tagged 1, smile Blake, 2, it me, and then 3, give me like 5 or 6 years. Reading these tags after Brockington's death is somber. They are a reminder of a young life lost, of the many intersecting structures of violence that Brockington and other Black trans people confront. But these tags also reflect how Brockington's Black trans politics of refusal were oriented towards a Black trans horizon, a future aspiration that envisions a world where, as C. Riley Norton puts it, quote, "Black trans lives will have mattered to everyone." In his calls to action, Brockington stresses the importance of working with and uniting with community and friends. And in the use of those tags, beyond dreaming of a Black trans future where he can continue to break this binary, Brockington articulates an intimacy and a yearning and a palpable relationality that expands beyond linear time and space. To conclude, though he may not have known the person in the photo personally, Brockington built affective community with this person, and for his followers, for the people on Tumblr who knew him like digital neighbor, he reciprocated that intimacy and yearning, even through digital distance, and even in passing. So thinking about the many ways that we can articulate passing, both in terms of the no longer living, both in terms of distance, and both in terms of the trans sort of idea of what it means to pass. In many ways, Blake Brockington's Black trans politics of refusal demands we create communities in passing, or to return to Jose Esteban Munoz, queerness as collectivity, as horizon, and as hope, even if that also means coalitions of the right now. Blake Brockington's articulation of a Black trans politics of refusal embodies that which Christina Sharp describes as the asterisk in trans, a place that opens the possibility of Euro-Western genders dismantling, a place defined by its inability to be held. It is a place where Brockington, in passing, continues to demand of us his friends, to unite, to yearn together, and to do so not under his singular political leadership, but in relationality. Or to appropriate Janelle Monáe, prom court royalty though he might have been, Blake Brockington was not yet another ruler. All of his friends, all of those fleeting intimacies and passing that he shared and continued to share were kings. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I did see that we had, maybe they left the, oh, no, I think we have a Christina in the group here, and I just want to see if that's our other presenter. Christina, are you Christina Jones by any chance? Looks like you're muted there. Christina, you're muted. Okay, maybe she's talking to someone else. So I just wanted to make sure, because I wanted to allow her to have time to present her paper if that was her. So I'm not sure. So if we find out, we still have some time left in the session. But I just wanted to, I guess, turn now to questions. If the Christina that is not, that is on the Zoom here, are you Christina Jones by any chance?
Hi, how are you? I do apologize.
That's okay.
Okay, so I'm currently in 2 sessions.
So okay.
Trying to finesse and finagle that. But
okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Jones, and I am a current master's student at Howard University. Today, I'm going to be presenting on the critical typologies that Black women use to elicit social political change. And these are some of the findings within my master's thesis. So I'm just going to try to share this screen.
Okay. Do you have the ability to be able to do so, or no?
Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm going to start from the beginning. So once again, this is a presentation on the critical analysis of the theoretical typologies Black women use to elicit political and social change. During this presentation, I'm going to go over the purpose, the historical context of Black women oppression, historical and contemporary race gender specific examples of Black women oppression, and the ways in which Black women used, like the typologies in which Black women use to affirm agency, and then a question and answer portion of time is allotted. Okay, so the purpose of this study. In some circles, there has been a raging debate regarding the theoretical and conceptual origins of Black women's expression and political thought. This debate is centered around an epistemological dilemma that examines the race and gender-specific oppression that has led to the subjugation of Black women. So in efforts to adequately review the theoretical and conceptual implications of the race and gender-specific oppressions in which Black women face, this presentation is intentionally constructed to provide an in-depth analysis of the typological approaches Black women use to elicit social political change. I'm going to be critiquing some of the work of notable Black women epistemological contributors in academia, and I'm going to dissect the narrative and theoretical and conceptual implications that center Black women experiences and Black women expression as a form of political resistance. So looking at the historical context of Black women oppression, the intersecting identities of Black women in the most basic sense as being both Black and a woman has led to marginalization, degradation, and exploitation in areas that constitute race, class, and gender. Contemporary conversations of Black womanhood position the dismantling of the deleterious gender and race-specific oppressions Black women experience. The concept of Black women expression and the participation of Black women in the Black feminist, womanist tradition in America can be foundationally linked to the major racial dichotomy and disparities that led to the forced subjugation and enslavement of Africans in America. So stemming from this is ideas like craniometry, biological pseudoscience, and hysteria, which were centered around phenotypical variations, which led to the codification of race in America, thus giving way to the forced subjugation, enslavement, legal disenfranchisement, and widespread assumption and adoption of laws that had extensive implications for Africans in America. So during slavery, the economic production of capitalism was Black labor. Black bodies were seen as sexual tropes, and they were used to reinforce slavery. Black people were the victim of state-sanctioned violence and denied personhood. Okay. And stemming from the exploitation, the degradation are some examples, historical and contemporary examples of Black women oppression. So as previously stated, Black women's and Black people in general, their value was purely economic. They were seen as property and sexual tropes. After slavery, the bodies of Black women continued to be subjugated to exploitation, degradation, and subjugation and oppression, to include denial of personhood, exclusion from power positions, dialectical oppression, suppression of Black women contributions in traditional feminist discourse, devaluation of labor, and false narratives. False narratives to include the sexual sentiment that Black women were seen as immoral, insatiable, perverse, and the initiators in all sexual contact. And false narratives are a byproduct of the controlling images applied to Black women, which perpetuate a false worldview of Black women as hood rats or welfare queens. And historical examples of false narratives have been used to justify oppression and deny Black women agency. So looking further into some of the oppressions, historical and contemporary oppressions in which Black women face, I'm going to discuss sexual violence, specifically focusing on Bell Hooks' book entitled Ain't I a Woman, Black Woman, and Feminism. So in this book, the aforementioned notion of Black women facing historical oppression is affirmed in the historical analysis of Sarah Baartman, or also known as Hottentot. And her story has become central to Black feminist theory and politics, serving as the primary analytic vehicle for explaining the violence that the dominant visual field inflicts on Black female bodies. So when analyzing Baartman's story, Black feminists are often tasked to grapple with conversations centered around the male gaze, sexual violence, and white male perversion. Bell Hooks' novel uses historical sequential analysis that examines the relationship Black women and white men have. And in her analysis of the cruelty Black female slaves faced at the hands of white men in power, she argues that, and I quote, colonial white men expressed their fear and hatred of womanhood by institutionalizing sexist discrimination and sexist oppression. Okay, so going on to look deeper into the suppression of Black women epistemology and Black women contributions in traditional feminist discourse. In the movement for women's suffrage, Black women deconstructed hegemonic notions of acceptable and unacceptable forms of feminist discourse. The historization of women's movements and the intentional exclusion of non-white scholarship reinforces the idea that traditional feminist thought was filled with racist undertones. Examples of the previous point can be seen in the 1848 Seneca Falls Conference in New York, which profoundly voided women of color. While this conference is often perceived as a forging of women committing to fight Committed to the fight for equal rights and suffrage, the intentional exclusion of Black women reinforces the hegemonic notions of white supremacy that aided in the formation of racial hierarchies that have historically and presently asserted privilege to whites. By positing traditional feminist discourse as an egalitarian, all-inclusive subfield, and citing the Seneca Falls Conference as an example of this, white feminist thought continues to perpetuate a deficit mindset that fails to realize the contributions of people of color, such as Maria Stewart. Okay, dialectical oppression. So dialectical oppression in traditional feminist and Western political thought discourse suppresses the contributions of Black women. White male thought, for example, has historically been demonstrated in traditional scholarship at each level, while Black women experiences have been marginalized and distorted. By alluding to Black women in submissive discourse, a dialectical relationship has perpetuated and reinforced societal tropes. And this is reinforced in Anna J. Cooper's novel entitled Womanhood, a Vital Element in the Regeneration and Progress of a Race. The author asserts that Black women are uniquely situated at the intersection of suppressed womanhood and devalued Blackness. So in understanding this ideology that stems from Blackness, in understanding the ideology of devalued Blackness, originating the belief that perspectives and theoretical conceptions of Black women are deemed inferior to their Black male counterparts, and suppressed womanhood originated in the belief that Black women are deemed unworthy and inferior to their white women counterparts. The author, Anna J. Cooper, revolutionized how Black women traditionally envisioned reform, and she used this by calling upon the ills in which Black women face with sexism, denied from positions of power in religious institutions, and denied from womanhood. The notable contributions of this author suggest that writing this book of this magnitude during the time period in which it was written, and while relying on narrative theory, was a form of literary resistance that was used to intentionally shed light on authentic Black woman narratives. Okay, so now I'm going to go over two more historical oppressions, historical and contemporary oppressions in which Black women face, starting with victim blaming and marginalization of the experiences of Black women in the Black community. So, in an internal struggle to not succumb to Black patriarchy, Black women have historically experienced interracial violence perpetuated at the hands of Black men. When discussing discourse around the sexual harassment hearing against Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, it is often noted that the standards for professionalism differed across gender-specific lines. Anita Hill was often positioned under the stereotypes of an angry Black woman, and Clarence Thomas was an ordinary, hardworking Black man who was just engaging in common courtship. Media framing made it appear as though Black people would support any Black person, flaws and all, who was appointed to the Supreme Court off of Blackness alone. So in a response article entitled African American Women in Defense of Ourselves and Black Women Still in Defense of Ourselves, the authors demanded that the Black experiences of Black women be written as our own truths that speak against both feminist and anti-racist institutions that have frequently ignored the voices of Black women. The exposure emitted from both of these articles granted Black women the opportunity to unapologetically speak about the ways in which the exclusion of Black voices, sexual harassment, inequality, and poverty limits the upward mobility of both Black people and women as a collective. Citing that interventions that solely focus on the betterment of Black men with the hope that equity will somehow trickle down to Black women further reinforce the tropes and stereotypes that stretch throughout the Black community. And now we're going to go into some of the typologies in which Black women use to fight against some of the race and gender specific oppressions that I previously mentioned. And these typologies are the ways in which Black women have historically and contemporarily used to affirm agency. So as a result of incessant oppression, Black women have formed their epistemological theoretical framework, which centers their experiences to the forefront of agenda setting. The following interpretations of notable Black women contributions and epistemological conceptions detail the multiple oppressions in which Black women face and the ways in which they use deconstructing, censoring Black women narratives, and narrative theory to break the monotony and challenge hegemonic institutions that are hell-bent on perpetuating, maintaining their oppression. So Phenomenology is a qualitative research approach that focuses on an individual's lived experiences, as best exemplified in Patricia Hill Collins' definition of ideology. So in her novel, in her book entitled Black Feminist Thought, Collins uses lived experiences as a methodological approach to directly foreground the notions of self-definition. As previously demonstrated, the intentional phraseology can have an affirming or dismissive impact. So when looking at narratives that suppress Black womanhood and disaffirm their agency, narratives that include the welfare queen, narratives that include ratchet, loud, or angry Black women, those are a form of narrative discourse that have dismissive impacts. So Collins, in her novel, Black Feminist Thought, switches the way in which we look at self-definition by focusing on the experiences of Black women. And now we're going to go to deconstruction. Okay. So similar to the ideas around self-definition, Collins also uses this idea of deconstructing. So Collins affirms the claims by acknowledging the deleterious impact definitions have in Western political thought, and uses the epistemological and political spaces to affirm agency to disadvantaged groups that aid in remedying multiple oppressions in which disadvantaged groups face. So narrative theory is a theory that suggests that the features of narrative, such as interpretability, ambiguity, and narrative reconstruction, as well as literary discourse, achieve certain effects depending on the setting in which the narrative was told. So this notion is affirmed through the works of Alice Walker, who used narratives and expression to change the dominant patriarchal narrative and elicit social political change and create new political ideologies that tackle the unique complexities Black women face, both within gender and within their race. And this was done through her book that looked at In Search of Our Gardens. So the idea of her creation of the womanist definition, which was present throughout the novel. And she relied on the narratives of grandmothers and mothers in the book to formulate that definition. Okay. And lastly, of the ways in which Black women of the typologies in which Black women use to affirm agency, Black women center Black women narratives. It's similar to the narrative theory, but in this one, despite the gender and race-specific historical struggles Black women have and continue to face, they have distinctively been at the forefront of resistance. By erasing the dominant narrative and media portrayals that posit the fundamental association of Blackness and Black political thought in relation to patriarchy and the political economic order, the aforementioned examples of Black women political theorists and Black women epistemology highlight the power of centering narratives that uplift Black women and mobilizing socio-political action and discussion. The ways in which Black women challenge hegemonic narratives by asserting that their lived experience be valued and protected evoked voice within an otherwise silenced subset of the American population. Black women narratives and expression begets a diversified worldview that Black women change agents used to break the monotony, evoke contemporary self-perception, sustain and dismantle movements, capitalize on familiar conventions, and challenge the status quo. And are there any questions by chance? Or would that be at a later time?
Well, we're getting ready to open it up to questions. So thank you very much for your presentation. And before we get to the question and answer part of the panel, I just want to thank all of our panelists, including Dr. Jett, who had to leave us because she had another meeting to go to. I think that you all are working on some phenomenal pieces of work that are definitely needed within the field, and are really working to bring voices, particularly Christina and Isabel, to voices of individuals that are often not really thought of or not really necessarily given the credit that they actually deserve. And it's about time that, we change that narrative. And I'm, as a not so old scholar in the room, glad to see that passion is still there by a younger generation, even though I'm not that much far removed from everyone there, that, you get the feeling when you're going through graduate programs that it's just you against the world and that there's nobody else doing the work. And it's just really good to see that work continues. And it really gives me faith as educator, that we're doing some things right, and that there are many people coming behind us that are really going to make sure that the voices that are often have not been heard or not been given a seat at the table actually have a seat at the table. So thank you for doing that. So I want to, before I ask any questions, I would much rather turn it over to individuals who are here that have listened in, and if they had any comments or questions they would like to offer our panelists, I would like to open the floor for them to do that now. So you can just feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment for one of our panelists. Okay, that's okay if you don't. I can ask a question or two. So in terms of this question is for Isabel, is that you had mentioned the difference of how the spelling of boys was used. Or boys was used. Could you tell us the difference between the B-O-I and the B-O-I-Z, and why that is actually important for the work that you're laying out here in your paper?
Yeah, so as I'm going through the Brockington archive, which is just his archived blog, I think that he makes a lot of interesting choices when he's making these decisions on how he's going to spell particular things. So very early on in his blog, he had this tendency to, instead of using G's, he would use Q's. So it's, in terms of thinking about B-O-I versus B-O-I-Z, I think in part there's that decision specifically to, I think, in terms of building that community. He's articulating this sort of call to action that is this call to action for all of his followers, all of those people he would consider friends. But I do think that there is, in terms of, B-O-I versus B-O-I-Z, there is that sort of decision there that is a decision that is informed by, both this youth position. I think he's making these decisions to kind of play around with language in ways that do very much feel like this is a youth position. But I also do think that there is that sort of racialized position as well, that use of Z, similar to the specific choice of the use of B-O-I, boy, that has to do with his position as a Black trans person. yeah, so I do think that it relates back to his choice of BOI with 3 I's versus BOY, because another thing that I didn't bring up in this presentation specifically is one argument might be, well, maybe he chose BOI because BOY was taken. But when we go to the blog that is Brown Boy Magic with a Y, we see that it was created long, I think actually almost a year after Brockington's original blog, the more well-known blog. So he made this decision somewhere around along the line to choose to self-identify, to self-name with that particular spelling. And I do think that that speaks to this long articulation of this problematizing of gender and a specific understanding of gender as always already racialized.
Thank you. And I have a kind of a follow-up question. So since his passing, have you noticed any of, I forget the term that you used, it just literally just blanked on the term that you were using for the community that he had established. Are you seeing, or have you seen others kind of, I guess, take up that mantle and kind of express that, you know, when we think about gender, when we think about sexuality, when we think about expression, it's very fluid, or has it kind of just stalled since then?
I think that at least thinking about how trans identity has become very, in many ways, mainstreamed, I'm kind of contrasting him against that Buck Angel figure. So this older white trans man who's saying only binary genders are the things I'm going to recognize as legitimate. So in many ways, we look at things like, you know, the mainstreaming of many white trans elites. So I think it's Health and Human Services. The most recent nominee is a white trans woman. So we see that there's a lot more visibility of binary trans people. But at the same time, I do think that if we look at these alternative spaces, so outside of these elite level spaces, we do see a lot more people who are in these sorts of, who were growing up in the same sort of online communities that he was in, that Brockington was in at least, embracing these sort of alternative or non-binary, beyond non-binary as, you know, gender identity to check on the census data, these articulations of gender. So in the broader span of the dissertation, I put Blake Brockington in conversation with Mark Aguilar, who is was a Filipina-American trans feminine artist. And so both of them I'm kind of situating as these two figures are very visibly, almost exceptionally representative of how we see a shift in how many people of color, how many young people of color, particularly young trans people of color, were articulating gender outside of this sort of appeal to respectability and appeal to this gender binary that we saw, or that we do currently see being mainstream. So I think it's not something that I can say, oh, it directly, like these people who directly followed him were influenced by him in this specific way, because I think that passing element, so I know somebody in passing, that is really indicative of a lot of online relationships. It becomes almost ephemeral and it can't, you know, you can't make that direct connection, but I do think that there is that sort of, like I said, that influence in passing, that community in passing that shows us where those echoes of his influence and those echoes of this community that he was part of have developed the 5-6 years after his transition beyond the physical.
Thank you. So Christina, I have a question for you, and then we can open it back up to the panels. I mean, to the room. Sorry. I was wondering, when you were doing your analysis of these different typologies, did you notice anything in terms of generational differences in terms about how Black women use their voices?
Yeah, so looking at the historical analysis of the ways in which Black women use typologies, I started with Maria Stewart, and then I transitioned to the Civil Rights Movement, so looking at the speech of Fannie Lou Hamer, and transitioned to literary resistance in terms of Anna J. Cooper, which was before Fannie Lou Hamer, of course. And then Alice Walker. I looked at Kimberly Crenshaw and things of that nature. For the most part, it's this idea of literary resistance in traditional and non-traditional forms, even when looking at like Sojourner Truth's speech, how that's like a non-traditional form of resistance in terms of a speech. And then that has transitioned to different forms. But in terms of like the historical and contemporary analysis of the typologies, they all relied on their experiences. And that's something in which I really value in this research, is the relying of Black women experiences and centering those narratives as a typological form to resist oppression, marginalization, and subjugation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have like 10 minutes left, so I don't want to monopolize the whole time they're asking questions. So does anyone in the room have anything that they would like to add, or I mean to ask, or that they would like to make a comment about? You can feel free to just unmute yourself and just go ahead there. Okay. Looks like we cannot hear you. Is it Zen? Okay, it's okay. And it looks like there is a comment in the chat from, okay, go ahead. I think we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. I don't know why I can't remember that. Okay, so these were both really, or they were all great papers. All three were great papers, very, a lot to think about. I have two questions, one for Isabel and one for Christina. Isabel, I'm wondering if you are engaging the work of Marquise Bey et al., particularly his most recent book on, the title is The Problem of the Negro is the Problem for Gender. And he makes some of the similar, he's also building off of Snorton, or sorry, I actually don't know which pronouns Bey uses, so I'll say Bey, but Bey uses Snorton as a springboard to think about the ways also that race and gender are always deeply intertwined. And Bey ends by thinking about John Brown and the revolt that he fomented at Harper's Ferry as this like way of transing, in that Brown, right, is absolving himself. He's ridding himself, right, of the privileges of his whiteness, right, by trying to spark this rebellion. And I think Bey focuses a lot on trans in that sense, what it means to trans in this way that is like a disavowal of the link between white supremacy and masculinity. And I think that your work would be really interesting in the sense that you're making a similar argument from a different perspective. And so I was wondering if you had that on your radar, or encourage you to check that out. And then Christina, my question for you is, I was really struck that one of the paradigms that you didn't use was intersectionality. And I was curious if you had a reason for doing that, and I wanted to know more about that. So again, thank you for the papers, they were great.
Yeah, to answer your question, I rely heavily on Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality within the full thesis. But just for time, because I am transitioning between this and then a concurrent session that I'm in like at the same time, I chose not to speak on it. But definitely intersectionality is another form in which Black women use, specifically Kimberly Crenshaw and other theorists that align with her ideology, used to understand and tackle social justice through intersectional lens. So moving away from like that single analysis access to one that analyzes all the identities.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that had any questions or comments for our presenters? Dr. Willoughby Harad, I see that you put a chat, and you did a comment in the chat. Would you care to vocalize that now?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, everybody. I've been coming in and out a little bit ghostly-like. I apologize. I hate it when they schedule everyone I know at the same time, but I'm also super patient about it. So I was thinking about you being a political theorist and the work that you're doing, Isabel, to try to theorize from Mark and Blake's lives, and also what it means to the people in the communities that are still living the life that both of them lived, and who maybe knew both of them intimately or as friends. So like, I wonder, what would it cost you? How would it change your project? How would it breathe life into the project for you to position yourself as somebody, I mean, even to share how you come into contact with Blake Brockington and Mark Aguilar, like what they make possible for you in terms of your own subjectivity. You know, what is the kind of intimacy of relation that calls you into speaking about them? Which I know is a very high expectation. Nobody asks, you know, somebody writing about Trump, like, why do you think you have the right to write about Trump, right? But because the conditions of life and social death, the risks are so high for Mark and Blake, I wonder if there's a step missing that's, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so that's something that I have been reckoning with. I think part of why I chose to really look at Mark Aguilar and Blake Brockington was because I was on Tumblr when the news of Blake's death broke. I was part of that sort of process of collective mourning. And it really does stick with me as this, it really did feel like this world-shattering loss at the time. And, you know, as much as I do theorize that intimacy in passing and that intimacy of somebody who glanced upon a life in the way that we are, you know, more frequently glancing upon each other's lives in this digital zeitgeist, I do take the point that there is an importance to speaking to those people who knew Mark Aguilar and who knew Blake Brockington in real life. And that's something that's, you know, to share in the sort of autoethnography of this project. It's scary because it does sort of do that work of theorizing and breaking down that sort of the I suppose safe shell that is theory building. But you know, it is fundamentally important, and that is one of the next steps. I have been doing some reaching out, or at least starting the steps to reach out to folks who were in more sort of close relationships with Mark Aguilar and Blake Brockington at the time of their lives. And in terms of Mark Aguilar, I know I didn't talk about Mark Aguilar at all in this project, but I do think that a very big part of my political socialization on Tumblr as a website, as a queer of color subject, was seeing Mark Aguilar's work, having that sort of feeling of I am being called and hailed by this person in a way that I hadn't felt in many ways, and in many spaces, even on Tumblr, even, you know, in spaces that were more intimately, you know, in person in that way. So I think that's kind of emotionally, affectively, autoethnographically, that's where I'm coming from. And yeah, I think that's, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
So that pretty much ends our time. I wish we had some more time that we could, you know, talk a little bit more, but that is our time for the session. I want to thank all of our panelists for your wonderful pieces of scholarship, and I thank you all for being part of this session, and thank you for suggesting resources and ideas for our panelists. So thank you for joining us. Okay. Everybody.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm supposed to be,
Welcome.
oh, I apologize. I'm all over the place.